Welcome to the All About GTM Podcast, where I invite thought leaders in my network to spill the tea on everything go-to-market. I am your host, Jade Maravillas. Today, I'm joined by Tim Hogg, a behavioral scientist who helps businesses communicate more effectively and deliver fair value. With over a decade of experience advising on regulation and policy, particularly in financial services, Tim has testified before the European Commission and worked extensively on FCA's Consumer Duty. In this episode, we explore the science behind purchasing decisions, how companies can simplify financial communications, and why clear human messaging is key in regulated industries. Hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I did recording it. But for now, here's Tim Hogg. So Tim, I met about a couple of years ago now, I think. Has it been that long? It feels like yesterday.
A while.
Yeah. And we worked together because in my previous role, when I was looking after marketing for Dojo, I needed to rehaul our communications to make sure that it was consumer duty compliant, which we're going to be talking a lot about today. But when I started doing this podcast, I was thinking a few people who might be interesting from a go-to-market standpoint. And I thought of you, Tim, primarily because when we talk about marketing, especially within regulated industries, it's actually really important for us to think about not only how we're communicating to our customers, but also if the way that we're communicating to them is adherent to regulations, especially in financial services and more regulated industries. So before we get into it, I wanted to get to know you a little bit better. I know that you're a behavioral scientist. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I started off as an economist. So I studied economics at university a very long time ago, over 10 years ago. It makes me feel very old.
And how did you get from that to where you are today?
Well, so I was doing economics. And then one Christmas, I actually got given this book. So if you're watching, you can see I'm holding it up. Literally the copy of this book. It's called Priceless by William Poundstone. And it's all about how you can influence customer choices through changing the price. And it is fascinating. And it was my introduction to behavioral economics. And I absolutely loved it. And it was given to me by my aunt and uncle, and probably haven't thanked them enough for starting me down this journey. So I read it, and I read more and more. And then I realized there was this whole field called behavioral economics. And so I did a master's in it. I wasn't quite ready for real life at that point. So I did another year of uni. And then after that, I thought, well, I was probably going to get a job as a behavioral economist, seeing as that's what I've trained as. So I moved to London and worked in a couple of different consultancy companies, applying behavioral economics to regulated sectors. And mostly that's been financial services. I have to say financial services is just a lot more interesting than other sectors. There's a lot more going on. There's a lot more money at stake from the customer point of view, I think, than other sectors. But actually, I realized over time, and maybe this is the case for you, Jade, that as your career moves on, you start to do different things. And actually, I realized that I started applying behavioral science rather than behavioral economics. So
What's
behavioral
the
economics
difference,
is very
by the
much
way?
thing. I could talk for hours about this. Basically, I mean, the important thing is that no one cares about the difference unless you are a behavioral scientist or a behavioral economist, right? So from an outsider perspective, there's very little difference. But behavioral economics is very much applying real-world insights to those economic models for how people make decisions and how they spend their money and save their money. So it's very much thinking within the sort of the personal finance economic world, whereas behavioral science is much broader and takes into account other factors such as the power of emotion or the power of habit when you make decisions. So behavioral science is more broad, more factors. Every good behavioral economist I know has rebranded themselves as a behavioral scientist over the last 10 years, because frankly, it sounds better. It's better branding. Science sounds great. Economics sound boring, but also it's just a reflection of the limitations of staying in the world of economics. If you go a bit broader, you get more insights, a bit more multis. Anyway.
You mentioned emotion being regarded as part of behavioral science. Looking at it from a behavioral economist perspective, right? Money, financial services can be seen as maybe a dry topic, but actually each and every one of us not only touches money, but needs money in our lives to be able to function, right? And it also dictates quite a bit of our level of happiness, so to speak. How do you see money, our relationship with money, affect the decisions that we make as consumers?
The example that comes to mind is anxiety. So in a lot of scenarios, we feel anxious about money and our finances, and it's not dumb of us to feel anxious. There might be genuinely worrying things going on, but the problem with anxiety is that it discourages us from engaging with our finances, and actually disengaging is often the worst thing that we could do, isn't it? If you have some debt that you need to repay, it's making you feel anxious. Disengaging, might not be in your interest. You might be better to speak to a debt advice charity, for example, and get some really good advice on how to repay it. So anxiety is a massive one for a discouraging engagement. If you look at the communications sent by lots of banks and insurers and asset managers and everything, it almost feels like they're designed to make you feel anxious, right? It includes all sorts of language and terminology that is outside our comfort zone, jargon, or just the tone of voice. And so it generates anxiety, which is unhelpful. I think what really good providers are doing is redesigning the way they talk with customers to try and trigger less anxiety, to get more engagement and better outcomes for customers. Also better commercial outcomes for the firms as well, actually. Anxiety is not all. Customer anxiety, I don't think, is usually in the firm's interest either, especially with a problem debt, for example. Actually, you do want the customer to engage and repay as much as they can, and anxiety won't help with that.
Coming from the other side of the table, right? I was in a position of doing marketing communications for a financial services company. I think I can speak for myself and my colleagues. You don't necessarily craft your communications with the aim of making someone feel anxious. However, I guess from an industry point of view, there's certain ways of communicating that is deemed as acceptable or standard that might not necessarily be something that as a consumer is how we speak or how we want to be spoken to.
We spend a lot of time talking to providers about how they might be exploiting biases or exploiting emotions. And we always say the language of exploitation, by the way, which is used by the FCA. We use this language, but we don't imply intent. We're going to assume that none of this was intentional on your part. It's not about whether you intended to make anyone feel anxious, but it's the environment that we're in. And it's about trying to put yourself in the customer's shoes, which can be really, really hard. If you've been working in financial services for 10, 20, 30 years, to try and forget everything you've learned and stick yourself back in those shoes is quite hard, isn't it? And that's often where consumer testing comes in, because if you're not 100% confident in your ability to think like one of your customers, you can ask one of your customers and see how they think about it as well. We've seen lots of improvements, but there's still a long way to go, I think.
So let's take a step back, just because we went from pure behavioral science/economics background into talking about emotions and communications. But maybe let whoever's listening know what you're currently doing and how you're working with these companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for an organization called Fairer Finance. We're a unique organization. We're about 20 to 25 people, mostly based in London. And we have a mission to make financial services fairer for consumers and also the businesses that serve them. James Daly set us up 11 years ago now, and we speak up for consumers. So you'll see us mentioned in the press campaigning for better outcomes for customers. And we also do product ratings. And we do lots of polling, asking consumers how they find their banks and insurers and asset managers. And then we also do consultancy, which is part of the business that I mostly focus on, which is where firms come to us and say, okay, how do we do better? How do we communicate better? How do we deliver better fair value to end customers? So that tends to be all I do.
And how did you end up at Fairer Finance?
As I say, so I got using behavioral economics in the world of financial services and became 100% financial services in consultancy. And then I was aware of Fairer Finance beforehand, probably wasn't aware of just how unique we are and the different ways in which we influence policymakers and providers. And then James called me up and said, Tim, I've got a perfect role for you. And we talked about it. And then I realized that it sounded really exciting to shape a small organization. It's really nice to be an organization of our size. We can change and be agile and adapt and do new things just like that, which is great. But also it's the relentless focus on customer outcomes above all else. That sort of mission-led business is a real attraction. It's a real joy to work in an organization where we have a single driving purpose that gets everyone up in the morning. And that's probably why we're hired by providers as well, is from for a sort of independent voice. Sometimes we deliver good news to providers like banks and insurers, and sometimes we deliver very challenging news to them. But that's why they get us in, because we're not afraid to give them the challenging news as well.
I'd like to find out what is the science behind what motivates us as consumers, and how can companies, financial services, but maybe just companies in general, be able to tap into these intrinsic, innate behaviors that we have, and bearing in mind that these can be potentially sensitive, so to speak, because there will be some, I guess, vulnerable situations that these financial services companies can take advantage of in our decision-making processes.
Yeah, I like to say that we're in the market for making good decisions quickly as customers, rather than perfect decisions slowly. So if you go back to first basics, we have cognitive limitations, which sounds a bit harsh, doesn't it? But it reflects the way that you and I don't have brains the size of small planets. We need to make decisions within our scarce cognitive resources, and also within our time budget and our limited attention as well. So, financial services companies, they're competing for these scarce resources in the minds of their customers. And frankly, financial services, not only does it make people feel anxious, frankly, most people find it incredibly dull. And we sometimes forget that because we find it so exciting to think about the behavioral science of customer journeys and communications. We forget that most people aren't interested. And so you're really competing against all the other decisions in life that people are making. We're not making decisions in a vacuum. You're opening a letter while having breakfast, while feeding your kids, or you're opening an email on your phone while you're on your commute, and you've got messages coming in about what you're going to be doing tonight, right? Real world scenarios, cutting through is really difficult, isn't it? And you've got this tension between what people say they want to do. If you sit them down in a quiet room and you do some consumer research and you say, Jade, do you want to save more for your retirement and have a good quality of living? And what do you think you're going to say in that scenario, right? Exactly. Obviously. In real life, right, cutting through to the fact that you're living a busy life, right? It's very hard to motivate us to make those decisions immediately, isn't it? And especially if we think it's going to take a lot of time to make the right decision. If there's no obvious, quick way of making a good decision, we're quite likely to go for the route of inertia. I think that's what, just take the pensions example. That's what a lot of people do, right? You're auto-enrolled and you think, well, it's going to take ages to work out how much I should save. I don't really want to save more because I quite like spending it out, or I feel like I can't save more because of, the cost of my mortgage has risen over the last 2 years or whatever. It's quite hard to cut through in those cases.
Do you think a lot of the anxiety is also driven by the fact that a lot of people don't actually have a level of financial literacy, and it intimidates them to make these decisions because these are decisions that will ultimately affect their future and their family's future?
One of my favorite stats is something like 1 in 5 people say that they find maths so anxiety inducing it makes them feel physically sick or something. I mean, that may be an overestimate, and that's based on one survey, right? But the point is, maths and numbers does make us feel anxious. We tend to underappreciate the impact of compounding and compound interest, for example. Many of us struggle to understand percentages, and there's a whole ton of this stuff going on. And in that context, financial literacy is an issue. I don't know what you think, Jade. I'm a bit of a skeptic on whether we should focus all our efforts on improving education in secondary school. Yeah, obviously, improving financial education in secondary schools is a no-regrets move, right?
Yeah, I think
yes.
As a mother, I have a 6-year-old. And actually, you know what? I'm really happy that my daughter is in the state school that she's in, because I do believe that in the last month or so, they started talking about money, whether that's mostly what the coins are and how that relates to the physical money itself. But I'm hoping that also goes into how we deal with money. But schools aside, I feel like a lot of the financial education that we have come from our families and our culture, right? The way that our backgrounds have shaped us and our relationships to money is equally, even more so, as important as it is being taught in schools.
I agree with that. There's some fun papers showing that, I can't remember what age it is, but there's a key age at which, if there's a recession at that age, you are going to be more risk averse with your money for the rest of your life, right? And that's because that's the point at which you become aware of what's being discussed around the dining table or over the sofa or whatever it is at home, right? What we like to say is it's all about touch points, not teaching. So are you reaching people with the right information at the right point when they need it? Because the problem with relying on school education is tons of it is going to be out of date by the time people need it. Like when I was at school, no one would have told me about buy now, pay later because it didn't exist. And even if it did exist, I would have forgotten it by the time I needed it. A lot of the time, like if you talked to me about mortgages in school, I would have, it would have been a long time, a long number of years before I actually was able to get a mortgage. So education in schools could be really brilliant, especially the impact of compounding. We can get people more confident with percentages and the way that compound interest works. That would be amazing. And basic rules of thumb about managing debt. But I think there's always going to be a burden on providers to communicate well about their products at the point when people need them.
A big focus of what you guys do at Fair Finance is to help financial services and regulated industries adhere to the FCA Consumer Duty, which is also the reason why you and I got acquainted. Let's take a step back, and if you can let us know what Consumer Duty is in relation to the FCA guidelines. And I guess that my follow-on question would be, how can companies make sure that they're adherent to it?
So the Consumer Duty is probably the biggest change in regulation of retail financial services, 15, 20 years, or maybe even more. We also say that it would be unthinkable without behavioural science. Because what the Consumer Duty does is it puts the onus on the firms to act to deliver good customer outcomes and avoid things like foreseeable harm. Well, customer harm is only foreseeable because we have behavioural science. Because we have behavioural science, we can predict how people are going to behave when they see a letter or when they go through a journey or when they have a particular price in front of them, right? So because we know how people, or we're able to predict how many people will behave, harm is foreseeable, which means the Consumer Duty can exist. So it's very much underpinned by all those behavioural insights. And there's lots of detail to it, and the FCA has written hundreds and hundreds of pages about it. But I think two key things to call out. The first one is that firms have a higher level of obligation now to deliver customer understanding. So previously, all the regulation was you have to write things clearly, in a fair way, and without misleading people. And if you think about that, you can probably do that without ever actually achieving the fact that the customer understands what you're doing, right? So that's very much process on you. Did I write it fairly? Did I write it clearly? And all the rest of it. Whereas the Consumer Duty changes it and says, well, it don't really care how you wrote it, but the customer's got to understand what the important stuff, right? So I guess just to wrap up, consumer understanding part of Consumer Duty has massively changed the impetus on providers to actually get you to understand it rather than just give you the information and hope you understand it. The other really key part to draw out is providers have a higher obligation now to deliver fair value. So to make sure that their prices are commensurate with the value they provide. And the key thing here is not just to think about the average customer, which previously some providers would have done. So, the hypothetical average customer got great value, but now they have to think about the full distribution of customers, so all the customers. So they have to delve into the fact that you, Jade, might use your product in a particular way. That actually means you get really terrible value. And so now providers have to look at you and go, actually, we need to change how we're selling products to Jade and make her aware of what's going on or change the product. So that has also changed how providers think about pricing.
That's really interesting. I guess what is fair value to one provider might be different from another. Is there a standard definition of what fair value is, and how can companies look into data to show that what they're offering is of fair value?
There are certainly really useful ways, common ways of thinking about fair value, which unlock the question. My favorite way is to start off this work by always asking, who are your most profitable customers and why are they your most profitable customers? So who are they and why are they profitable? And actually that tends to unlock quite a lot. So if it turns out that your most profitable customers are all behaving in a certain way, which means they're not getting the best value out of the product, or they're all behaving, maybe they're all inert and they're not using the product, or maybe they're using it in a way that is generating extra fees and charges for you, but in a way that they don't understand isn't optimal for them. Maybe those fees and charges were avoidable. Do you see what I mean? So it really sort of unpicks, maybe there are issues going on there. On the other hand, if your most profitable customers are still getting a really good deal. They know what they're doing. They're not behaving in ways that you think are slightly odd or at odds with the purpose of the product. Well, then that's quite a high degree of assurance for the rest of your customer base. And it really sort of taps into that analysis of your business model and thinking, what's really driving our business? Is it good customer outcomes, or is it people who are maybe making poor decisions? Because if it's people making poor decisions, at some point the regulator is going to catch up with you and there's going to be an issue.
And is that like, putting hidden fees and charges that a customer may not necessarily know about, but you're making a lot of money from that particular customer because of that?
Yeah, exactly. Another example, this is one of my favorite examples, is overdraft. So the average overdraft, this was based on analysis the FCA did pre-Consumer Duty, but the average overdraft customer was dipping into their overdraft towards the end of a month, maybe a few times a year, right? Well, that's exactly what an overdraft is meant for. They're getting a great outcome. They dip in towards the end of the month, it's payday, they come back out, and then they're okay for another month or two. The overdraft is doing what it should be. But actually, the most profitable customers, the people who were really driving the profitability, were people who were in their overdraft almost constantly. So imagine being in your overdraft for like 300 days out of 365, right? That's an extremely expensive way of borrowing money. There are cheaper ways of borrowing money than using your overdraft. And that's not really what the purpose of an overdraft is. It's not meant to provide long-term credit. You should be getting a personal loan or a credit card at that point. It's not, so always being an overdraft isn't great. It's not a great decision. In that case, it was those people who were driving the business model and they were getting poor outcomes.
What would a financial services company do to be able to extend the right service to that particular customer in relation to the consumer duty?
I think there's two things that providers should be doing for those people who are in their overdraft for months and months. So the first thing is communicating and making those communications really, really salient, making sure they cut through, avoiding anxiety, but really getting through to people the fact that this is a really expensive way to borrow money, right? So there should be absolutely no ignorance on the part of the customer that they're in their overdraft, that they've been in their overdraft for a long time, and it's costing them an awful lot of money. Okay, so that's the first thing you can do, is make sure people are informed and really go the extra mile on that. Get the evidence that people know what they're doing. And then the second thing is signpost and nudge people towards more appropriate products for them. Because actually to be in your overdraft for months and months is not the cheapest way to borrow. You should be on a credit card or in a personal loan, probably. And at the very least, you want to be signposting that or having that conversation with people. And it's about, again, going the extra mile to have those conversations. And it might mean calling people up, or it might be sending them push notifications, or it might be signposting them to other products, or maybe debt advice charities as well, right? So, rather than just sitting back and, milking it, essentially, getting all the money in as profitability, you need to go, actually, this isn't in your best interest. You're really not using the product as we intended it to. But we offer this other product here, which would suit your needs, or we don't offer it, but actually other providers do, and we think you should go to them. So really giving people more guidance on that.
And that's not just focusing on the communications, but rather also the service that they give, right? So in your experience working with these financial institutions, how have you guys advised them to look beyond just what emails or what letters they send and actually take a step back and understand the actual customer journey and how that relates to the service that they should be providing?
We do a lot of thinking about friction, essentially. So it's like high friction, it means it's slightly harder to do something. So it could be more clicks and scrolls on an app, maybe. Or high friction could be having to print off a form and send it in. I was outraged a few weeks ago when I had to print off a form from my building society and send it in order to do something. And I was like, this is 2025. I had to go and find the printer and plug it in, right? When do we ever use a printer these days?
I was going to ask, do you have a printer?
Well, so thankfully we do. And thankfully it's still had ink. But actually loads of people don't. And actually there's a socioeconomic dimension to this as well, right? So it's not very inclusive to require people to print something or something off. So I was like completely outraged. And my wife had to suggest that maybe my outrage was disproportionate to the level of inconvenience that it actually was for me just printing off a form. But that's an example of excessive friction. Whereas other times you might look at it and go, oh, this is actually too little friction. People's intentions haven't been tested. And the classic example of this is cryptocurrency, where the FCA is really worried that people, especially young men, tend to be cryptocurrency investors, although the word investing is interesting in the context of cryptocurrency. But anyway, young men going through, not stopping to think about the implications and the risk that they're taking on. And actually, in those cases, the FCA is trying to get providers to have more friction so that people really understand the risk that they're doing. And they may still decide to put their money into cryptocurrency, but actually they may not if they realize how risky it is.
That's really interesting. I was actually just talking to someone about this recently in relation to the customer journey in general, right? Whether friction is, I think from a product standpoint, there's a lot of focus on product development to remove as many clicks or as much friction as possible. But sometimes actually you might want to introduce extra steps, maybe in relation to what you just said, but also sometimes people might not trust something that's so easy, right? And introducing one or two other steps to make it feel like, oh, actually, they're doing necessary checks and balances to protect me as a consumer. Do you see this in practice?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, some of the cybersecurity stuff that you have to do when sending money or logging into your account. I mean, there's an argument that it's actually, in a few years, we won't need passwords anymore, right? There'll be other ways of verifying who we are. But I think banks will be really reluctant to stop asking us for a password because it makes us feel safe and increases trust. So I think that will be a really hard one to remove. I think people in many instances will quite like that sort of old-fashioned password approach rather than just relying on a fingerprint or multi-factor authentication.
That's really interesting. So one of the things that I do is I advise and I work with a company that's revolutionizing voice biometrics. And so one of the big ideas was to have a passwordless world. You just speak and you get identified. But I've also, now that you mentioned that, kind of thinking it's the same way that me as a consumer, I go into an Amazon Fresh and it still freaks me out a little bit whenever I just have to walk out. And it feels a bit like, I'm not sure if this is correct. Even if I had to verify myself before entering, it's the frictionless going out that just feels a bit like, I'm not sure about this, even if I know I didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think, Jade? Do you think that sort of frictionless journey is the future, or are we sort of too ahead of our time on it? I mean, I live around the corner from an Amazon store, and I'll be honest, it's basically always empty, and I never go in it. I go to the Tesco's next door. I think basically everyone on our high street does that. What do you think?
I have to agree. So in my neighborhood, there is one as well, and I almost never see anyone in it. In fact, the only reasons why I've been there is because I had to pick up a package or return something through Amazon, and then I just so happened to be there, so I have to pick up some groceries, right? And when I do it, as I mentioned, it does freak me out. With regards to the voice authentication, I think it makes a lot of sense for it to be part of a multi-factor authentication where you might have other forms of identification. Also because there's just so many ways that scammers can steal our identities today. Passwords, personally, I really don't trust passwords anymore. I mean, even if they say use a different password for every single thing we do, I guess like most consumers, you only have a limited amount of headspace to actually think of what password you're going to have for that particular week or month. So having it as part of a multi-factor authentication probably gives it a little bit more trust, so to speak, from my perspective. But I wanted to hear your thoughts from both a consumer and a professional in this case.
I mean, we're constantly going to need to innovate, aren't we? Because the fraudsters out there are innovating, and our innovation needs to be in a faster place to stay ahead of them. So yeah, I mean, anything we can do to authenticate with a higher degree of veracity is going to be great. And yeah, I think it's about maintaining that consumer trust as and when some older ways of verifying our identity maybe aren't needed anymore. But we'll see where we are. You can't go too fast, can you? Because like bring people on the journey with you.
Speaking of being consumers, right? We've talked about how companies can inject consumer duty into their communications. But as consumers, and we are all consumers, how can consumers know a little bit more about what their rights are and know when companies are breaking that trust or breaking those rights?
So the consumer duty is really meant for providers to think about rather than consumers. It's hundreds of pages on the FCA website trying to tell providers, banks and insurers how to think about this stuff. But as a consumer, you can now make complaints to the Financial Ombudsman Service through the lens of Consumer Duty. So if you feel that you weren't communicated with effectively, or that something wasn't fair value, you can now bring those to the FOS. So you've got to go through the normal process you're always used to, which is go to the provider, get the complaint processed, and if you don't agree with the outcome, you can take it to the FOS at the Financial Ombudsman Service. But the FOS will be considering Consumer Duty. A lot of what the FOS always considers, a lot of cases that go to the FOS often hinge on the communications that people actually received. And often cases will be won on the fact that something wasn't really clear. And it's probably continued to be the case even as the standard raises, as the standard gets higher. But you can't complain about something that's not Consumer Duty compliant if it was 10 years ago, say, right? That wasn't the standard at the time. It's only now that duty is in force, you can sort of refer to it in your complaints and get somewhere.
So I think we've spoken a lot about having more clear, humane communications with customers, with consumers. But is there any specific examples that you've seen of companies that are getting it right? And if so, what does that actually mean from a operational perspective? Is it, they shy away from jargon? Is it that they explain things clearly? Is it they go one step beyond just showing it through words, but also illustrating it? So can you give us a little bit more information about how that is in practice?
There's tons of good examples across every area of banking, insurance, investments, pensions, whatever. There's always a fantastic example there. For example, on jargon, we've seen tons of jargon removed, and we work with providers to help them remove that jargon. You should see less of words like liability and liable in your communications, and more communications that just simply explain what your responsibilities are and what the provider's responsibilities are. So tons of jargon is being removed. Still a long ways to go in certain sectors. Investments particularly has the most jargon. And so that, they've got a bit of work to do there.
What's your pet peeve in terms of jargony word?
I find the world of investments probably the most pet peeve, if you know what I mean. I think it all starts with the risk warning. You see on websites still capital at risk. Let's just go through those words. Capital is jargon. I don't go, all my capital is all kept with the building society, right? Capital is not something you would say in normal conversation. And at risk is vague and worrying. And it's not clear what they mean. And so it's just this big warning that you don't understand and induces anxiety. And actually, I've been part of research with Tizer, one of the trade bodies, where we found that many people are off-put investing just because the risk warning is a bit confusing. And actually, it hurts inclusion as well, because women tended to be more put off by bad risk warnings than men, which is interesting, isn't it? So if we improve risk warnings, which is possible, and some providers have much better risk warnings now, then it's in their commercial interest as well, because they're getting more people investing who wouldn't typically have invested. So there's tons of stuff like that. There's words like diversification, which is used. I mean, I can't even count how many syllables that is. Is it maybe 5 or 6 syllables, diversification? You don't need to say it. You just say, don't put...
6.
How many is it? 6. Thank you, Jade. Yeah, my maths let me down there. You don't need to say diversification is great. You just say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. People get it, right? It's really intuitive. You can do this stuff without needing the jargon. Some jargon words you need, but it's vastly less than you actually probably have.
So I guess if you had to use a jargony word just because that is what's acceptable within the industry, you could still explain to the consumer what that actually meant in plain English.
Exactly. And the other pet peeve we always have is that people explain it, but they put it in a glossary or a definition section that no one is ever going to read, right? Let's just be honest here. No one reads definition sections. They might as well not be there. So instead, why don't we define it wherever we use it? Because you do have to sometimes use words that are jargon, right? Because the regulator says so, or the law says so. You can't get around it. So yeah, wherever you use it, have a little tooltip if it's digital, or a little box if it's non-digital explaining what you mean. And that just makes it so much easier for normal people as we go through in our normal lives to navigate what on earth is being told.
One thing that I was really curious about is I know that a lot of companies would use this to hide what they really mean, or to make it less easy for consumers to complain and to churn. Do you have examples of companies that have applied consumer duty correctly and it's led to better, not just customer outcomes, but also better business outcomes?
I think there are some really good case studies of where people engaging more leads to them, say, saving more or investing more, and that's obviously in the provider's interest. Sometimes there is a trade-off, right? So I was once with a car insurer that made it impossible not to renew through excessive friction, right? And that's clearly in their commercial interests to make it impossible for me to switch away. But actually, there are loads of great examples, especially in the world of pensions and investments, where getting a bit more engagement leads to people actually saving and investing a bit more, which is in the provider's interest. Also, in insurance, if you can overcome lots of the behavioural hurdles, you'll sell more life insurance. A lot of people who would benefit from life insurance don't have it in this country, so that would be another win if we can get people a bit more engaged by explaining the jargon, explaining what else is going on.
And I guess lastly, we talked a lot about consumer duty and the financial services industry, but I feel like consumer duty can be applied to communications, marketing in general across different industries. What advice would you give to practitioners in other industries that might not necessarily be as familiar with consumer duty as they're not regulated by the FCA? But how can they inject more humanity in their communications and dealings with their customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd love to see the principles of consumer duty applied to other regulated markets as well, and maybe regulators will get there. I think a lot of it comes down to communicating effectively, forgetting all that industry jargon. I mean, I see it with my broadband provider. There's a lot of jargon when I get a letter from my broadband provider. It's just different jargon. Instead of talking about insurance, it's talking about wires. I don't understand anything about those wires.
What wires?
Well, exactly,
Broadband
right?
wires.
I understand. Yeah, I understand there must be a broadband wire in my garden, looking at it right now, but I don't really understand anything about it. So it's really about putting yourself in the customer's shoes, communicating clearly, and also making sure the level of friction is right for different things. So just being a bit more customer-centric, I guess, would be part of the principle. Obviously, there are loads of fantastic companies that do that brilliantly already, but there are still some regulated markets where it feels a bit of a hassle to engage with your provider.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tim. That was really insightful. Before we end, where can people find you and if they wanted to avail of your services?
So we're on LinkedIn, so you can look us up on LinkedIn. We've also got a website, Fairer Finance. So if you just Google Fairer Finance, you'll find us. But yeah, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening. If you like that episode, please consider subscribing. Read my blog at www.newmarketgtm.com and follow me on LinkedIn under Newmarket GTM. Next, I'll be speaking to the enterprise PMM on all things product marketing. So please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. See you for the next one.